All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of the Ken Wilber Show. I am here with the man himself, Mr. Ken Wilber. Ken, how you doing, man?
Good, Betty.
Good. I think today's going to be a great show. We've got some really cool questions in store for you. And yeah, I really can't wait to see how you respond to these. I mean, these are questions that I myself have been thinking about a lot lately. Particularly after the last couple episodes that we've done. You know, our first episode together was sort of about the political quagmire that we find ourselves in. The second episode was, you know, sort of trying to track, okay, well, what brought us to this point in the first place? And we talked about social media and we talked about postmodern excesses and all of that. Today's show, I think we're going to be talking about something that, at least to me, really represents sort of a remedy for a lot of the challenges that we're going through politically, culturally, socially, geopolitically. And that's basically integral thinking. And in my, you know, the first question I have for you today, I often differentiate integral thought from integral thinking. In other words, integral thought, it's almost like integral is a noun. You know what I mean? Integral thought is the products of integral thinking. It's what we've spent years exploring here on the website: quadrants, levels, lines, states, types, the entire integral map. Whereas integral thinking, this is actually talking about the sort of thinking, the type of thinking that allows people like you to produce things like integral maps in the first place. So I was thinking today, one of the things we would talk about are some of the major qualities of integral thinking, particularly at the vision logic or construct aware stages of development. What are some of the markers of a healthy cognitive posture that should be taken by integral thinkers? And I think this is really important, Ken, too, because, you know, as we've talked about a lot over the years, there's a lot of different ways to enact integral, right? I mean, in integral, we've got a lot of people who are really into integral and have been studying integral for years, who are, you know, nonetheless still cognitively orange or cognitively green, cognitively right, teal, turquoise, and all of those are going to actually express and enact this big, beautiful vision in sort of some different ways. So I thought it'd be helpful for us to, you know, basically point to a couple road signs. So, you know, it seems to me that some of these qualities, at minimum, would include things like, you know, having a both and mindset instead of an either or mindset. There's a capacity that comes online to hold paradox and deep nuance, rather than sort of simplifying things, oversimplifying things. There's a natural empathy that comes online that comes from a fluency with perspective taking. I think there's a recognition of some of the differences and relationships between things like mind and consciousness and spirituality. I think a lot of these, you know, we start discerning a lot of what those terms actually mean in our kind of moment-to-moment experience. There's a striving to find, you know, what's often called the third win at every opportunity. So I win, you win, and sort of the total evolutionary system that we're a part of also wins. And there's also a sense of optimism, I think, that really comes from somewhere beyond our own frame of reference. So it's an optimism that sort of transcends sort of the, you know, where we're at and what we're struggling with and what we're challenged by. It's an optimism that is almost a more, you know, I think of it almost like an integral mind starts to see things almost like a geologist see things, and you start looking at the world in terms of like 5,000 year chunks rather than, you know, 5-minute chunks.
Right.
So that was the first part of the question, and then there's a second part too, which I can just read right now, or we can save it. However you want to go.
Your call.
Okay. Well, why don't I just get it all out, and then you can get it all out, and then we can have a little bit of back and forth.
Okay.
So, second, when it comes to the principle, so the first part was about the qualities of integral thought and sort of the cognitive postures that we can take. The second is the principles of integral thinking. And when I try to think about, you know, what are sort of the bedrock principles that we can use, I always go to 3 terms that you first introduced in one of your excerpts from the second book in your Cosmos trilogy, which was titled The Many Ways We Touch. And those terms are non-exclusion, enfoldment, and enactment. And those are, you know, those are heavy lifting words for sure. A simpler version of that might be something like everyone is right. That's kind of the main idea behind non-exclusion. Some are more right than others, true but partial. That describes the enfoldment process. And then if you want to know this, do that, which is enactment. And these terms, they came about while you were putting together your integral methodological pluralism framework, which, for those who don't know, is a robust meta-paradigmatic scaffolding that seeks to honor, include, and integrate multiple paradigms and methodologies and practices across all domains of human knowing. As you say in the many ways we touch, these three regulative principles, non-exclusion, enfoldment, enactment, these are principles that were reverse engineered, if you will, from the fact that numerous different and seemingly conflicting paradigms are already being competently practiced all over the world. And thus the question is not, and never has been, which is right and which is wrong, but rather how can all of them already be arising in a cosmos? Or if you put differently, what is the shape of the universe in which all of this is somehow true? And although these principles are really intended to help thought leaders, and so forth, make their particular fields of knowledge more expansive, more comprehensive, more complete, I personally think they can be taken more generally by the rest of us as basically three essential qualities of the integral mind. And these can be used as, kind of an ongoing heuristic micro-practice to help us see more fully, communicate more skillfully, and discover the most effective solutions to whatever problems we happen to be facing. So maybe we could take a quick look at each of these principles, how they can be used as cognitive guardrails while navigating the incredible complexity of our lives and the world around us. And then finally, I'm curious whether you think integral thinking can itself be somehow systematized into a teachable process, kind of like critical thinking, and whether you think these principles might actually represent the core of that process, and finally, whether that process itself, whether you think that process could actually help accelerate people's growth into these integral stages of development, whether it can actually help people in that growing up process. So that was a lot. And I'm curious to see how you take this on.
Okay. Let me jotting down some notes here. What you're talking about when you're talking about the qualities of integral thinking is more not just what you're looking at, but how you're looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And the how is not as often given as much attention as the what.
Right.
And in part, it's because things like scientific materialism make up their mind about how this is the one true way to look. And then they just spend their time examining what's. There is, study bacteria, study planets, study geology, and so on, all using the same how, and just trying to come up with different what's. But once you start looking at the how, once you start looking at the quality of thinking itself, what's going into that, one of the first things you find is that you're dealing with perspectives. Mm-hmm. And perspectives are really rather extraordinary things because they reflect the fact that every holon in existence occupies a different space. And therefore, if nothing else, it sees the world from a different angle than every other holon.
Right.
So there are different perspectives inherent in everything that exists. And taking those perspectives into account can be extraordinarily important. And particularly if we track evolution and see various holons becoming more and more complex. So if you have like atoms, and then whatever the atom's perspective is, atoms are taken up into molecules. So now we have a molecular perspective on reality, but it's including atomic perspectives, so those are still there. And then molecules are taken up into cells. Cells have a perspective on reality, but they're still included in the molecular perspective, which includes the atomic perspective. So this starts to get as richly diverse. The how you're looking is as richly diverse as the what that you're looking at. So it actually turns out that at least some developmental psychologists actually define a major stage of development as adding a new and major perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So Levinger does this, for example. Suzanne Kuckreuther does this. And you can see various very bright people based on their research who are doing this. So, for example, in a Levinger type of system, you start out and the young infant and child can only take first-person perspective. And so that's essentially magenta and red. That's the perspective that they have. As growth and development continues, the young child learns to actually take the role of other. Mm-hmm. So it can actually start to see the world through another person's eyes. So it adds a second person perspective, and that actually moves it up into an identity where it can start to identify with second person groups. So instead of just identifying with their own I space, they can start to identify with a we space. And it might be they're identified with their family, their clan, or their tribe, or even more mature, their nation, even all members of their religion. But they move from an egocentric into ethnocentric stances of identity. As growth continues, they add a third person perspective. That turns out to be, in Piaget's system, for example, formal operational cognition. And so that third person perspective can actually see universal systems. You can't see these from just first or second person. So this different perspective is actually bringing forth a different reality. Mm-hmm. And that's a really crucial point about perspectives. And this is part of the principle of enactment, that different perspectives actually co-create the phenomena that they're aware of. That mm-hmm. phenomena aren't just given, and then you have these different levels of interpreting this one single given phenomena.
Right.
It's one of the primary things you learn from developmental studies is every major level sees a different world. And that, for people who are studying epistemology and ontology, the people that don't take that into account, like most forms of realism, are missing a major point about reality. So somebody who's just a pure realist thinks it's just the objects that they're aware of. That's the one real reality. And you can interpret it differently. There's really only one right way to interpret that because it's just one given material, sensorimotor, objective reality, and that's what they're aware of. And that's, according to every developmental model in the world, that's massively wrong. That's not how it works. So you can keep adding. Orange, modern systems can take this third-person perspective. That's why when historically human beings started to do that, we actually started to get the rise of virtually all of the modern sciences, because those were taking a third-person, hypothetical, deductive, systemic view of reality. We hadn't done that before. So we really didn't have those kinds of sciences before. Also taking a third-person world-centric perspective meant that literally for the first time, we weren't just thinking about the rights or the morals of an individual group. In other words, if you're a Christian, then you have certain rights. If you're not a Christian, then you don't have those rights. So if you accept Jesus Christ as your personal savior and you're a fundamentalist Christian, then you get to go to heaven. A Hindu doesn't go to heaven. For a fundamentalist Christian, Hindus in heaven just don't work. They just can't picture that. That's not going to work. So it was only, so through all of those stages of our historical development, essentially the first 300,000 years we were on the planet, we still had slavery.
Right.
Every modern religion, major religion, not modern, every major mythic religion had slavery. Buddhist monasteries had slaves. Christian monasteries had slaves. It was so widespread, I pointed this out before, but it's just astonishing. The American Indians took their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears,
right,
for heaven's sakes. And so only in around a 100-year period from around 1770 to 1870, slavery was outlawed in every single rational industrial nation on the face of the planet because they were operating from third person universal morals, not just what's right if you're a Catholic or what's right if you're a Frenchman, but what's right if you're a human being.
Mm-hmm.
So we went from rights in here in particular tribes to what all tribes have in common, and that's humanity. And so rights belong to humans. These are universal rights that all people have. That was a staggering change.
And I've always loved, Ken, how that was described. It was described as we find these truths to be self-evident, but they're only self-evident at minimally an orange stage of development.
Well, exactly. And even though, I mean, what happened at the time is that these principles of universal rights for all people, it was still, the cultures at that time were still ethnocentric.
Right.
So there was still a dominant culture in Europe, for example. Yes, it was white, European, male, able-bodied, usually propertied. And universal rights were eventually applied to just that tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So we would say, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. That just didn't happen to include black men or women or, you know, but the principles were coming from Orange.
Right.
And that meant those principles kept being applied and kept being applied. And so more tribes and more tribes and more tribes were brought into the tent of universal care. And so that was what blacks got rights, women got the vote, LGBTQ got marriage rights. Now we're looking at transgender rights. I mean, it kept expanding. Those original Orange principles kept expanding. More and more tribes included, because it was focused on what all tribes have in common.
Right.
Not what just makes your tribe special. Right. Not just you're male, so you get this right. You're female, you don't get it. So you can keep adding perspectives. By the time we get to the 60s and green, postmodern comes in, it has a fourth person perspective capacity. And in the simplest terms, that just means it can reflect on the previous third person systems. And so where Orange would come up with universal systems, like there wasn't just Hindu chemistry and Jewish chemistry, there was just chemistry.
Right.
Universal chemistry. What Green started to do is reflect on all of those single universal systems. And because it had an increased capacity for differentiation, it started to differentiate them all. And it said, okay, wait a minute, there isn't just one culture that's true and everybody else is wrong. It's that by differentiating these single systems, it came up with a multicultural view where all cultures are equal We can't say that one is superior, one is better, anything like that. So this multicultural egalitarianism, it became the value that Green most promoted. Mm-hmm. Now, in a certain sense, that's absolutely fine, and it was a step forward. But what Green could do is that although it could differentiate these systems, it didn't yet have the cognitive power to integrate them.
Right.
And so it could show how they're all different and they're all important and all the tribes, should get an equal value, but it couldn't bring them together. It couldn't actually integrate them into an all-inclusive framework. Mm-hmm. And so it just left these things to go in their own separate ways. And this eventually ended up leading directly into a culture wars.
Right.
Because everybody re-tribalized.
Right.
We just worked our way in to treating all tribes fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. Now, all of a sudden, we've re-tribalized, and you only focus on your sex. You only focus on your race. You only focus on your gender. You only focus on your creed. And that's what's important. So all of a sudden, you're no longer emphasizing what you have in common with other tribes anymore. It's just you are a tribe. And it's that tribe versus this tribe versus this tribe versus this tribe. And that's the culture wars. And without finding a way to bring those together, then the fragmentation, the friction, the anger, the aggression just continues to increase. So what we find as we move into second tier, into the first stages there, teal, then what you see is the capacity to integrate differentiations emerges. And in some ways, for the first time in history. And that's why Claire Graves called it cataclysmic and a monumental leap in meaning. Because all of a sudden, it did do that. Yes, we can differentiate all of these diversities and all these multicultural, tribal groups, all of which have value, all of which are important. But now you can hold it in a unified framework. You can actually find ways that they all fit together. And the reason that they all deserve rights is not because just one tribe gets rights and these tribes get rights, but because all tribes sharing that unified human reality, that's why they all get equal rights, because they're all equally part of this common humanity. And without that, it's just tribal warfare.
Right.
So you add a fifth person perspective. And in Commons and Richard's research on higher cognitive stages, they found 4 major stages, and these actually apply to orange, green, teal, and turquoise. So orange is the one that could first see through third person perspective universal systems. And so Commons and Richard just called this stage systemic. Mm-hmm. And then we saw green adds a fourth person that can reflect on systems. And so it can differentiate them and end up with a multicultural egalitarianism. Commons and Richards called that meta-systemic, because they're looking at systemic. But they couldn't bring these meta-systemic fragments together. When you get to teal, that's what teal can start to do. Right. It looks at all these different fragments and binds many of them together into unified frameworks that fully acknowledge and honor the differentiations, but also unify them in a broader context, in a broader framework. And so they can actually start to create things that might be called, for example, paradigms, which take a lot of different things, work them into broad, large disciplines. Mm-hmm. Commons and Richards call that stage paradigmatic. And then when you get to turquoise, turquoise looks at all these paradigms that teal has created and all the unity in diversities that it's introduced. And then turquoise says, okay, now how do all of those paradigms fit together? And so that's the highest stage that Commons and Richards recognize. It's sort of the highest stage that orthodox developmentalists recognize. But we, of course, in integral meta theory, we tentatively recognize third tier stages. And these are 3 or 4 even higher stages that we have some type of evidence that they exist. They just happen to be very rare right now. But as evolution continues, we expect to see more and more people moving into those. So the point here is that each of these perspectives is seeing a different world.
Right.
And again, it's not just that there's a single material pre-given world, and each stage looks at that same one world and interprets it differently.
Mm-hmm.
It's that with each major level of development, the injunctions, the actions, the paradigms at that level enact and bring forth different phenomena. Now, they're not just creating them. There are realities there, but they're being brought forth and enacted by these different perspectives.
Right.
And these different perspectives are all forms of, if you want to know if it's raining outside, go to the window and look.
Right.
So a real paradigm is not, well, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the 3 principles of non-exclusion, enfoldment, enactment. But a paradigm isn't the way it was almost always misinterpreted, which was that it was some sort of big super theory that created facts. And so people using it this way would say there are like 3 or 4 big paradigm shifts in modern science. There was like the Copernican, and then Newtonian, and then Einsteinian, and those are the big paradigms. And now we're on a new paradigm that sees everything interwoven, and it's the same as the mystics and all that kind of stuff. That's not how Kuhn used it at all. And in his book on the structure of scientific revolutions, he didn't outline 3 or 4 revolutions or paradigms. He outlined hundreds.
Right.
And what each of those were was just an actual practice, something you actually did. It was a methodology. It was an injunction. He got so upset with the way paradigm was being used at large that he stopped using the term entirely. And he started using the term exemplar, which means exemplary injunction. Mm-hmm. So it's just a specific methodology that will bring forth a different set of data. It's enacting that data, not in just it's not just inventing the data. So people, again, misusing his concept, would say, therefore, progress in science is just completely random. There really isn't. It's just, you can choose any paradigm you want, and facts can't determine which is right and all that. Totally misusing it. Kuhn said, quote, I, for one, am a staunch believer in scientific progress. So it's the fact that each of these major levels of development is in itself a series of injunctions or paradigms or exemplars that will co-create the phenomena at its level. Right. And so new realities are brought into being as we continue to grow and evolve.
So Ken, is it fair to say that each of these stages brings with it its own truths that become self-evident at that stage? So at red, I find these truths to be self-evident. Corey is fucking awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay? Amber, we find these truths to be self-evident. There is only one God.
That's right.
And then, obviously orange, green, teal, turquoise, all of these have their own self-evident truths that come online and can be perceived for the first time at that stage, right. And which then becomes sort of like first principles for everything that emerges out of that stage.
That's right. And what we tend to end up doing is, when it comes to science, for example, well, first of all, science, if you sort of the broad attempt to discover some sort of, quote, objective truth, you can see that each of the earlier stages, including magic and mythic, had their own forms of science. So mythic, for example, had alchemy, that at Orange would become chemistry. It had astrology, that at Orange would become astronomy. And it had humoral psychology and bile and phlegm and all that stuff. And that would become more like big five factor psychology at Orange. So you can see that kind of stuff happening. And the way we tend to decide truth in science is the leading theory at the highest stage of development that's being engaged in that science. So if you just look at how atoms, or just the most fundamental particles of the universe, were looked at, when atoms were first discovered at Orange, people like Niels Bohr would actually picture atoms like little solar systems. And they actually thought they had like a sun that was the nucleus, and the atoms went around them just like planets, and those were actually, that's what it was like. That pretty soon, as green started to move in with its much more pluralistic, multiplicity kind of views, it discovered quarks. And quarks were just kind of all over the place. And in sort of perfect keeping with the green pluralistic relativistic stance, there was no real way that they could pull quarks together. But they were no longer looking at atoms as fundamental and little planetary solar systems. They were actually made of quarks in ways that weren't quite clear. But so we had that going on for a long time. And then as Teal emerged in that field, a discovery of a framework that brought all those quarks together in a unified view became, it's sometimes just called the standard model, that just sort of the way that physics tended to take as truth at that point. And then as you got up into turquoise, it's kind of moved into extraordinarily complex things, but that are capable of integrating even more aspects of physics. And this was string theory and variations on that. That's become so complex that even advocates of string theory acknowledge that there's no empirical experiment that they can think of that would prove or disprove the existence of strings. It will never happen. And so now it's just become kind of a Pythagorean consistency model. And we used to say, okay, physics gives us, it's our hardest science, dealing with rocks and earth and all that. And now it's some sort of 11 dimensions in 500 universes, but they're all sort of unified, kind of somehow.
It's almost a weird return to a metaphysics.
Well,
almost.
in a strange way it is.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is folks like realists, again, we say, okay, well, there's just one reality there. And so we say, okay, well, which is it? Is it the orange view of just planetary atoms? Is it the green view of multiplicity of quarks? Is it a teal view of the standard model, eightfold way quarks? Is it turquoise? So which one is it? And the point, again, is simply that different levels of development unfold and enact different phenomena. And our best guess, the way we do science, is we go with not that we're aware of what we're doing, But in effect, what we do is end up taking the highest level of development we have and the theories that have the most acceptance at that point. And that's what we call the most fundamental realities that exist. And so we go back to something like tribal times 400,000 years ago. And I make a distinction, of course, between what subsists and what exists at any given stage.
Can you say more about that?
Atoms did not exist for any tribal member. There was nothing in a tribal awareness that included atoms. It just didn't exist for a human being in tribal times. But we don't say, therefore, there were no atoms.
Right.
So atoms were subsisting. They were there, but they hadn't come into awareness. They weren't brought forth to exist in human awareness. So they subsisted, they didn't exist. And by the way, this is one of the reasons, because of subsistence, that integral theory is not guilty of an epistemic fallacy. It doesn't do that. But it does point out, and this is simply the tricky part, when we say, okay, there was some sort of quantum level reality that subsisted 300,000 years ago with tribe. What was it? Was it planetary atoms? Was it quarks? Was it eightfold standard model? Or was it strings? And so what we take to be the real subsistence reality is determined by the interpretation of the highest level of development we're at.
Right.
So we see how they're tied in. You can't just separate them. You can't equate them, but you can't just totally separate them. So one of the things that you would be tracking, if you're tracking these different objects, atoms, quarks, strings, is you're also looking at the perspectives that brought those forth. And perspectives, my point so far is that perspectives include not just changing the scale of something, and that's largely how science looks at it. So we have sort of this meso realm where Newtonian physics still works. I mean, we put a person on the moon using just Newtonian physics, but then you can get either very small or very large dimensions. And then the physics changes in those dimensions, because again, those are different perspectives in terms of just size. And so at the very small, we have quantum events and things like Planck's constant and so on. And that tends to explain that, the micro dimension. And then at extremely large spaces, we get relativistic physics.
Right. Yep.
And the constant c, the speed of light, and that kind of thing. Okay. So that's one way to do dimensions. But another way is these dimensions of consciousness, levels of consciousness. Those are enacting, because of their different perspectives, they're enacting different dimensions in each case. And so, as I say, that's the first thing you learn with developmental studies, is that each level of development co-creates an ontologically different world. It's not subjective idealism. It's a true co-creation or enactment.
Yep.
So if you start with just a single given occurrence, or just a given happening, before it's labeled or conceptualized or busted up into anything, it's just a single event. Although even the word single doesn't really apply because you haven't started applying those conceptual differences. But what you can do is approach that happening, and you can look at it from a subjective stance and simply get your specific subjective responses, reactions, feelings, viewpoints, understandings, insights, whatever it might be, about that event. But then you can also attempt to stand back in a more objective stance. And again, assuming you're at orange or higher and you have these distinctions available. And those turn out to be two very important they're two very different perspectives, first person and third person. Mm-hmm. And so they're showing you different dimensions of that reality. And one of the first things that you learn, just from the principle of non-exclusion, for example, mm-hmm. is that each paradigm, each perspective is going to bring forth phenomena. And those phenomena just in themselves are real. You're not allowed to say those aren't real because in themselves, they're existing. They are what they are. You can say, well, those aren't true if you make a judgment compared to some other scale. Mm-hmm. So if you have an image in your first person awareness of a unicorn, and you can say, well, you know, a realist would say, well, that's not real. That's not true. Well, what they mean is there isn't something out here in my dimension,
right,
that corresponds with that dimension.
Yep.
And I go, I don't give a shit. I'm not talking about your dimension.
Right.
I'm talking about this dimension.
Yep.
As an image, that image in the unicorn exists.
Yep.
Whether it corresponds to something out there or not doesn't matter at all.
Especially if you step into my 5-year-old daughter's perspective.
Oh,
she knows they don't exist out there, but unicorns are real.
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the reasons that I can say things like, for example, everybody's right. Somebody should, okay, well, wait a minute. What about Santa Claus?
Right.
Now you go, well, okay.
Yep.
If you look at the actual mythic stage of development that works with concrete operational realities, so you tend to get what's called mythic literal phenomena. Mm-hmm. That stage will tend to produce Santa Claus. It'll produce Zeus. It'll produce Apollo. It'll produce Jehovah. It'll produce Apollo and on and on. And those are real at that level of reality. Mm. And we can't just so quickly say, oh, but we know those are wrong. They're not wrong at that level. And humanity for thousands of years was at that level, producing those phenomena and worshiping them left and right.
Yep.
You can't just go into it, by the way, that's all wrong.
Right.
No, it's not. It's right at that level. That's a real phenomena. It's a real reality. Now, what happens when you move up to higher level is that you add a perspective. So you can reflect on that. And you can then say, okay, there isn't actually a Santa Claus really flying around out there that's really going to come down your chimney. I understand how it's real for you, not denying that. But you can make that kind of judgment. Mm-hmm. But what you can't do is ever stop and say, okay, this is the only correct judgment.
Right.
Because 500 years from now, they'll look back on that judgment as absolutely idiotic as you're looking back on Santa Claus.
Right.
And so, I mean, 94% of the universe is dark matter. What the hell is that? That means all this stuff that we take as reality is only 6%?
Yep.
And that's just what we know, is that we don't know 94% of it. God knows how much we really don't know.
That's obvious where unicorns and Santa Claus live.
Well, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, our views will look absolutely as ridiculous and pathetic as mythic and magic views do now. So everybody's right, and because you can situate them in a cosmic address where the phenomena they're seeing are real.
Mm-hmm.
And then within those domains, you can make judgments. And so within a mythic domain, you can make judgments about which God figures seem more important for you if you're at that stage. So you might find, for example, that Jehovah is more important to you than the tooth fairy. And that's a judgment you're making within that realm, and you're allowed to do that.
Yep.
Because the same paradigm, the same injunction is producing those. And so within that paradigm, you're allowed to make judgments. What you're not allowed to do is use a different paradigm to deny that paradigm altogether. That's not an exclusion. You're not allowed to do that. So that's the way, sort of all the way up. So you're looking, you start out with just as happening. And you realize you can look at it in a subjective fashion. And when you do that, it's going to, what you see is going to depend upon your level of consciousness in that subjective space.
Yep.
And that will differ, and each of those will have their own relative reality. But then you can also look at that same happening from an outside third person perspective. Now, when you do that, you see very different stuff. And in particular, if you look at holons, and one of the conclusions that looking at holons through all of these perspectives is that at the very least they have interior or left hand and they have exterior or right hand. Mm-hmm. And the exterior right hand is what you can see with a videotape or a camera or some sort of recording device. If you got a small enough video camera, you could take a picture of an atom. We can actually see electrons with an electron microscope, and molecules. We can actually see the outsides of them. We can't see the inside. So what's the inside? The inside is prehension. The inside is its own little bit of awareness, a little bit of proto-feeling, a little bit of proto-consciousness. And so that's what we have in the first person, subjective realities of that happening. And then if we look at it in an exterior fashion, we're going to see its matter, energy, and form. And those are just things that exist in the spatiotemporal world. Mm-hmm. What we can't see are interiors. The same way I can't actually see your interior, you can't see mine. But we have an enormous number of ways that we can give very compelling reasons that those exist. Mm-hmm. And among other things, that's what language does, is allows us to exchange perspectives. I take your perspective, you take mine, and we attempt to reach something called mutual understanding. Mm-hmm. And that can happen within a relatively similar ballpark. And so that's a very important reality.
It's miraculous. You've described it as the miracle of we. Because, you know, here we are, like I've got all my thoughts in my head. You've got all your thoughts in your head. There's this chasm between us, and yet we're able to fill the space with language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shared meaning and shared values and all of that. And it really, it bridges these two sort of islands of consciousness and brings them together. It's miraculous.
Exactly. And in terms of, well, do we mean the same thing when we say something? People like Jürgen Habermas maintains that we all have the assumption that you can understand what I'm saying, or I wouldn't even try to talk to you.
Right.
if I was really convinced what the extreme postmodernists tell us, that we can't understand ever what the other person is saying, then why do they even talk? They wouldn't even talk if they believed that. It would be a complete waste of time. They just go in the corner, talk to themselves, and jerk off. I mean, that sum total of their interesting life. So we're tracking these perspectives as part of what happens in your awareness as you're approaching a given happening. And so one of the things we're finding is that you can see these interior and exterior, and in those interiors, find levels of development. In those exteriors, you can also find evolutionary stages of unfolding. That's just one part of it, but that comes from seeing these different perspectives and the dimensions that they disclose. And of course, in looking at that single happening, and we've seen that it has a subjective and an objective dimension, then we can also look at it in terms of its own individual being, and then the types of groups or collectives that it's a part of. Because we just don't know really hardly any holons that exist just by themselves alone. And in things like evolution, you can't even get evolution going forward if you don't have both the interiors and the exteriors, but also individual and collective. So quick example, if you're looking at the evolution of a frog. So what did the first frog look like? And the answer that could actually live and exist. And the answer is, well, it wasn't a single frog. At the very least, there had to be a male frog and a female frog. And if there wasn't that, you got no frog. It's not going to exist beyond this little accidental showing up moment, and then it's gone. So, there's actually a group of people. It's headed by a guy named Bruce Damer. And he's come out here and we've talked because they've kind of incorporated some integral ideas in what they're doing. And they're sort of on the very leading edge of creating, they're revisiting the whole notion about what did the original cell look like? What did life look like when it first started? And it's called abiogenesis, and they're working on that. And what we did through some extensive exchange between myself and Bruce was talk about how you just really you shouldn't be looking at just what the first individual was like. You needed to look at really all four quadrants. They all showed up at the same time. And so that's what you have to look at. And they agreed, and they actually created this sort of one of the original forms they're working with now is called a progenode. And it actually has sort of individual cell and community cells all wrapped together. It's like, and then the quadrants will differentiate out of that together. And one of the things that I really love is that, I'm always getting criticized by extremely conventional evolutionary theorists like Frank Visser, because I postulate eros, or an inherent novelty in the cosmos, which, by the way, is Whitehead's point. His three principles of all reality. Principle number one was the one. Principle two was the many. And the third principle he called the creative advance into novelty. Eros. Stuart Kaufman, self-organization is built into the universe. Eros. Ilya Prigogine, Nobel Prize winner. Order out of chaos. Even insentient matter, when pushed far from equilibrium, jumps into a higher level of order, eros. So I'm tired of these people saying that doesn't have any. But what I love about Bruce's work is and I love this term, it's so clunky. They say, now right at the beginning of this whole process is what we call the anti-probability machine. And that's what gets it started.
Right out of Douglas Adams.
Yeah, it's to jump into something improbable. But
Right.
that's the inherent beginning of it. It's not some accident or something. It's what's built in to the universe. And I love that. There's this inherent improbability machine.
It's fantastic.
Is at the beginning of all this. Absolutely fantastic. But so we're looking at these evolutionary unfoldings, and we're seeing that you can look at them again through perspectives that include interior, exterior, individual, collective. Those turn out to be the foundations of first, second, third person pronouns in languages.
Mm-hmm.
And every major mature language has all three of those, because as language was evolving, it was running into all three of those dimensions: first person, second person, third person. And it had to evolve to fit those realities. And so every language has those perspectives built into it. And that should tell us something right there.
Mm-hmm.
Though what it's also telling us is that the upper left subjective I space and the lower left collective we space and the upper right he, him, her, it space and the lower right they, them, theirs, its space are real realities. Mm-hmm. And each of these have different types of truths. They have different types of meanings and drives and motivations. They have different value systems. And so, and each of those have levels of evolutionary unfolding, and each of those have lines. So even in evolutionary biology, they distinguish between what they call a grade, which is a level of development, and a clade, which is a line of development. And these are all real and all four quadrants. You can keep going. And this is again, just as we're changing our awareness, as we're changing our perspectives, those are all the things that we see. We wouldn't see those if we weren't changing our perspectives.
Right.
Those just aren't lying around out there waiting for everybody to see. That's why no tribe saw Adams. That's why no world religions have an understanding of stages of growing up. You actually, like Kuhn, you need a paradigm to generate specific truths. Mm-hmm. No paradigm, no truth.
Right.
All you get without any extra paradigm is just what you get in your average everyday awareness. Right. And average everyday awareness, I put it the other way. I'd say 99.99% of the things that humans call true doesn't exist in your ordinary awareness. If you just look at your ordinary awareness, the sun circles the earth.
Right.
The earth is flat. Well, I could go on.
Yeah.
Not a lot of truth running around out there. So the paradigm is you have to do something to see these other things.
Yep.
Make a microscope, make a telescope, change your perspectives, look at levels of development. I mean, so perspectives are giving you these different objects. And we can't just start by trying to spot objects, because as long as we're stuck in a particular perspective, we'll only see the particular objects that are enacted by that perspective. Mm-hmm. There may be 100 other important perspectives that we're aware of, and therefore you're missing 99 of the other objects that are out there because you're not changing that. And you can keep repeating those perspectives. So we said you could start looking at just a single event, and you could look at it in a first person or a third person perspective. And that gives you 4 quadrants.
Mm-hmm.
You can look at any holon in any quadrant and repeat the same perspectives. So you can look at a holon in the upper left from the subjective point of view or from an objective point of view. And then you get 8 zones. And each of those zones have a different methodology because they're dealing with different data, different phenomena, different realities. And so that becomes absolutely crucial in terms of what's real. When we look at just these 8 zones, we find 8 methodologies, all of which are well known, well established by the people using them. That all of them have knowledge communities that have an enormous amount of compelling evidence that that's real. They have data backing it up. And yet almost every other methodology will deny their reality. That's just the worst way you can approach almost anything you can think of in this world. It's the worst way to build a philosophy. It's the worst way to build a political system. It's the worst way to build any society. It's the worst way to have a relationship. It's the worst way to find a job. Because all it's doing is saying, let me be blind to as many possible realities as I can be, because that'll make life easier for me. And I go, really? Good luck with that one. So what we have, just from looking at those perspectives, is we find out that any experience we have, any knowledge that we have, has a who and a how producing an object. Mm-hmm. So it has an epistemology, and those exist in the levels of consciousness. You have a different epistemology at each one, whether it's magic or mythic or rational or pluralistic or integral. And then you have methodologies, which especially come from these zones. So there are different things you do to help enact the phenomena in those zones. And then the who, the how generates different whats. Mm-hmm. So epistemologies, multiple methodologies, multiple ontologies. And these are all real, and they all fit together in an integrative meta-theoretical framework that we call integral. So those are some aspects of the thinking side of what we see. And then, of course, what we do tend to do is focus on the products and say, okay, let's look at quadrants, let's look at levels, let's look at lines, let's look at states, let's look at types. And of course, that's important. Mm-hmm. But these are some of the ways that we discovered those in the first place.
That's right.
Because the whole point is that all of them are data that require specific paradigms to enact. And without those paradigms, you don't see it. They're not lying around out there waiting for everybody to see. Right. We've already seen lying around out there waiting for everybody to see is a flat earth and sun going around it. Not very good. And one way to talk about that is that we have at least these first, second, third person perspectives. And we've seen we can run them out to a fourth person, fifth person. But at least we have sort of 1, 2, 3 P, first, second, third person perspectives. And you can keep just reflecting those a numerous number of times. So the who, epistemology, how, methodology, what, ontology, that's a 1, 2, 3 of a 1, 2, 3 of a 1, 2, 3.
Right.
And you can keep doing that.
Right.
But you at least do that and you get this whole levels of epistemology, 8 zones of methodology, and an integral pluralistic ontology coming from all of that. And that's what we get if we just track what we're doing in our own awareness.
Right.
So that's where all of those products can come from. You do that, and you get this whole levels of epistemology, 8 zones of methodology, and an integral pluralistic ontology coming from all of that. And that's what we get if we just track what we're doing in our own awareness.
Right.
So that's where all of those products can come from. And then I think you wanted to discuss non-exclusion, enfoldment, and enactment.
Yeah, I think so. And let me just say beforehand, kind of, it seems like of those 3 terms, one way we might be able to frame it is at integral stages of development, we find these truths to be self-evident. Everyone is right. Some are more right than others. And if you want to know something, you got to do something. Now, of those, the one thing I notice as I've been sort of grappling with this is that, non-exclusion is one of those things where it makes sense. There's an intuitive sort of sense that comes with it. Same with enactment, right? You're not going to know how many moons Jupiter has until you actually build the telescope and you look through it. The tricky one, and the reason why it's so tricky is because it really comes down to what is your cosmic address? What can you perceive from that cosmic address?
Right.
What are your various biases and blind spots and all that? Enfoldment is the tough one, because with enfoldment, it's like, okay, so I've got, particularly in today's culture, I've got, let's just say I've got a debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump 2 years ago. They're both barking what they view as truths at me. And if I take the stance, well, everyone is right. Okay, well, again, that makes an intuitive kind of sense. But if you get stuck there, if you don't go into the actual enfoldment process, you're just left with this green flat mush, right? Where it's like everything gets relativized because it's like, well, what Donald says is true and what Hillary says is true, and what everyone says is true, and you just kind of leave it at that. Well, no, now we have to take the next step of actually figuring out how to prioritize these different truths and fold them together into a deeper, more nuanced, more complex understanding of reality. And that can be really, really tricky. I don't know if there's a simple equation for that, like there is with non-exclusion. Non-exclusion, and it's not like non-exclusion doesn't have its limits. I mean, we practice non-exclusion insofar as you stay in your lane, right? We don't want physicists talking about, trying to prove or disprove, Freudian Oedipal theory or something, stay in your lane, and then those truths can be integrated. But the enfoldment is the question of how do we actually begin kind of prioritizing truths and building a larger fabric of understanding out of them.
Well, the way enfoldment is used, of course, is just in these 3 principles, is that it has to be seen as a part of all of those principles.
Right.
And all of those have to work together
in
order to give us an integral outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we focus on just one of them, then it can look like it's a little bit hard.
Mm-hmm.
But enfoldment itself is, at its core, the central components are very, very, very straightforward. And they're, in some ways, even more straightforward than non-exclusion and enactment. And the reason is that what we're working with here is holons.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't even have to assume that to get this going, but I'll just use the term because people generally understand what that means. But what you're looking at is you have a universe that in essence starts from nothing. And that might mean a lot of things, but it's,
Right.
There's pretty much kind of nothing happening. And then pow. And then if sort of there's just kind of the second law of thermodynamics and things would just kind of run down. But they don't. Right. They actually start winding up.
Mm-hmm.
And what you have to look at is, okay, just really focus on just moment to moment to moment to moment. How does one moment actually fit with the previous moment? Mm-hmm. And that's really crucial. And it tends to be such a simple thing that a lot of philosophers don't really look at that. They just take the results of it and start thinking about what those mean and all of that. Whitehead was one of the guys that said, okay, wait a minute, I got to have a look at that. Right. What he came up with, which I think is essentially correct, but he was just using subject and object, and I think it happens in all 4 quadrants. But I do agree with what he was saying as far as it went. And his point was that each moment comes to be as a subject of experience. And for Whitehead, he was a sort of panpsychist. Mm-hmm. So he believed that even things like atoms have a little spark of awareness. And of course, that fundamental form of awareness he called prehension. Mm-hmm. And prehension technically is a term that means feeling. And his point was that a subject comes into being, and then in the next moment, the next subject comes into being, and it feels the previous subject because it's right there, so it prehends it. Mm-hmm. So when that subject prehends that subject, then that subject becomes an object. Right. So subject of one moment becomes the object of the subject of the next moment. And that he called prehension or prehensive unification. And that was how the past influences the present. Because if you actually hug something, then it's going to influence you. Right. So that was causality in a sense. Now, if that's all that happens, and that's all the scientific materialists think happens, then everything, the whole universe would be a deterministic machine. Right. But Whitehead, this is where he added that crucial third point, the creative advance into novelty. Every subject, once it comes into being, prehends the previous subject, making it object. So this is now a feeler that's become felt. Mm-hmm. And so the new subject is there. It's prehended the previous subject and is now influenced by it. And then it adds its own bit of creativity. It adds its own bit of novelty. And novelty means novel. It means it's never appeared before. So it's really something new. Mm-hmm. And if nothing else, it's how this new moment appears new. It's different somehow than the previous moment. So some novelty got in there to hell somehow. And for Whitehead, it's just an inherent part of moment-to-moment existence. So, and he talked about the one, the many, and the creative advance into novelty. And so he would say, the many become one and are increased by one. Right. And so what's happening there is that the subject of one moment becoming the object of the subject of the next moment, and including the previous moment and adding its own bit of novelty. All of that is what I've always summarized as it transcends and includes mm-hmm. the previous moment. Mm-hmm. It includes it by prehending it, then it transcends it, goes beyond it by adding its own bit of novelty. Now, right, and that is what, there's no other way for a universe to keep going if something like that isn't happening. Right. And I just add, well, and it actually has to fit all 4 quadrants. Mm-hmm. So each moment it comes together, and each new holon has to fit with each of these 4. If it doesn't, it'll just go extinct immediately. It'll just drop out, and a next moment will emerge. If it fits, if it's selected by all 4 quadrants, mm-hmm. then it'll fit, it'll prehend, it'll add its own bit of novelty, and move forward. So right there, in just that moment to moment, transcend, include, that is enfoldment. That's the exact process of enfoldment. That's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so as this is going on, as long as it's actually fitting with the previous moment and then adding its own bit of novelty in it, the various dimensions, then that's going to, of necessity, keep getting more complex. Because it's including and then adding something,
Mm-hmm.
and then including all of that and adding something. And so that's going to keep going.
Yep.
And so that's how we went from dirt to the sonnets of Shakespeare.
Right.
It just kept adding and adding, and then from just absolutely dead life to living cells, to cells that were brought together in organisms that went from reptilian to mammalian to primate to humans, and then humans that went from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic. What the hell else do you expect to see if enfoldment is the very process of moment-to-moment existence?
Right.
Of course it's going to go that way. It has no choice. And if it's breaking down, then that just means the holons come into existence, and at that moment it doesn't fit any of the conditions of existence, and so it goes extinct. And under those circumstances, you could get a temporary backing up
Mm-hmm.
until it regroups and then starts forward again. And so that enfoldment also does things like, whenever you look at a developmental sequence in human beings, in any of the quadrants, this transcend and include continues to produce greater depth. And because of that, if you're tracking a holon in a particular line, in a particular quadrant, and you're looking at the levels that holon will continue to go through,
Mm-hmm.
then each higher stage of that holon has included the previous stages, but then also added new stuff. So it's transcended and included them. So in terms of the amount of truth that it would have, it has all the truth of the earlier stages, and it's added new truth of its own.
Right.
So this is a form of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Here you can actually make judgments. This is more comprehensive. And in that sense, it's better. But because it is more complex and more comprehensive, it doesn't mean it's always going to be better in all the kinds of judgments we can make about it. So you can get a high cognitive development that will develop very sophisticated instruments of destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And if you then look at the line of development that we would call moral, and that's lagging, then that whole situation can produce much more destruction than a previous stage. There's only so much of the environment, and there's only so many people you can kill with a bow and arrow. By the time you get to orange Nazis or Americans dropping H-bombs on Hiroshima, that's enormously more destruction
Mm-hmm.
than any of our tribal ancestors could even dream
Mm-hmm.
about. So there is that. And we make those judgments based on other lines that have like a moral line of judgment. And based on that line, we take the higher moral level and we say that's better than these lower moral levels. And the Gulag Archipelago is fucking low on that line. We can make a judgment about that. And so that's what enfoldment is doing. It's because the universe is always transcending and including, getting more and more complex and more unified and more conscious. Then because of that, we make judgments.
Right.
And the judgments reflect that inherent direction of eros, or order out of chaos, or self-organization, or whatever you want to call it. It's there. And that's how evolution itself unfolds.
Right.
And that's how we continue to see these types of increases that allow us to make judgments. And so that is part of what unfoldment allows us to do.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a common way that people will tend to not fully understand the intricacies of that. And that's when we deal with an unfoldment, and I talk about the simple metaphor of ladder climber view.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens here is, if we're looking at something like, let's say, just very generalized worldviews according to Gebser, and we go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. Those are worldviews, and those come because there's a ladder of development with cognitive rungs, and each of those cognitive rungs supports one of those worldviews. So if you're at pre-operational cognition and you only have pre-operational cognition, you don't have any higher stages, then you're identified with that. So you're looking at the world only through pre-operational cognition. You will see magic. That is your worldview. I'm not saying there aren't higher forms of magic or something. We're talking about simple word magic, where a child puts his head under a pillow, thinks that because it can't see anybody, nobody can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Magic. As pre-op starts to get more complex, and as it moves into con-op, then magic will shift into mythic. And mythic can take the role of other, so it can start to expand. It's still concrete. So Fowler called it mythic literal. And that means, for example, when the Bible says Moses parted the Red Sea, what that meant when it was originally written, it was mythic literal. It meant that literally. It meant Moses stood next to the Red Sea and he went, Yah, hit his staff, and the Red Sea bloody parted. He did not mean, when the person in the Bible wrote Moses parted the Red Sea, it wasn't some big symbolic statement about Moses finally gathered his people together and he overcame all sorts of resistance represented by the Red Sea. And he parted that and he joined the 12 tribes of Israel to a coherent political unit that would become Israel. And the person would have written that if that's what they meant. If they were trying to take all of that and put it into the little statement, Moses parted the Red Sea, that's not what they meant. What they meant was Moses parted the Red Sea, right. Period. So that's what happens if you only have concrete, literal thinking. Then as formal operational cognition emerges, and then you can take a third person point of view, and you can actually start to think rationally. That means hypothetical deductive. You can start to form scientific hypotheses. And so instead of mythic literal religion, we're not talking about waking up religion, we're talking about in the growing up stage. Then you're going to create science that's going to disagree with that mythic literal stuff. And here's, I'll just stop right there and give the point about enfoldment in this case. When we say in each of those cases, each higher stage transcends and includes its predecessor, that's true. But here's what's transcended and here's what's included. And the same goes for whiteheads, moment to moment, by the way. So you have pre-operational cognition. And when you're only identified with that, then you have a magic, what we call view. So the pre-operational cognition is things like images, symbols, and concepts. Mm-hmm. Those will remain. A child can form an image at around 7 months. And an image is a mental form that represents something by looking like it. So if you form an image of a mountain, it's because like you look at that mountain, then you close your eyes, form an image of it, then the image of the mountain looks like the mountain, and that's what an image is. It's one of the simplest cognitive forms we have. Then when you move up to a symbol represents something, but it doesn't look like it. So it's a harder thing to do. So the word Fido, name of my dog, Fido represents my dog Fido, but it doesn't look like Fido. It's actually alphabet. I actually have to know the alphabet. It's harder. Then from symbol, we go to concept. And the concept is a symbol that represents an entire class. So the word dog doesn't represent just Fido. It represents all dogs. Okay, those remain in existence once they emerge. So you can form an image right now. So then concrete operational emerges, and it brings schema and rules into being. But those can only operate on concrete objects. So Moses parted the Red Sea concretely, literally. That has access to all the pre-operational cognitive. It has images and symbols and concepts, but it's making those work according to rules. Now it's identified with that cognitive stage. So the worldview it has is mythic. Mm-hmm. So it's including the previous rung, but it no longer has a magic view.
Right.
And it can't, because it can no longer just identify with pre-operational. So it can get in touch with its pre-operational components and kind of sort of get a sense about what magic is, but it can't actually plug into pure magic without regressing. Right. It has to lose all access to concrete operational. Same then when you go to formal operational and the rational worldview, then formal operational has access to concrete operational. It actually operates on it. It's called an operand. And so formal operational thinking operates on concrete operational thinking that has access to pre-operational images, symbols, and concepts. So all of those are rungs in the ladder. And those stay there. When you're actually walking up a ladder and you go from rung 1 to rung 2 to rung 3, when you're at rung 3, you still have rung 1 and rung 2. Those don't disappear.
Right.
What you don't have is the view from rung 1 or rung 2. Those are gone.
Yep.
And so not only do people at higher stages of development sometimes have a hard time understanding lower views because they're not there anymore, but they're often completely contradictory.
Right.
They actually look at it and they go, no, that's wrong.
Yep.
Even though they're making that judgment using the rungs that magic used and using the rungs that mythic used.
Right.
But now rational thinks both of them are really screwed up.
Right.
So you have to be careful with enfoldment on
Yep.
that way.
Yep.
Because the enfoldment's occurring, but there's transcending and including. What's being included are the rungs.
Yep.
What's being transcended are the limited views.
And I often say, Ken, that this is one of the reasons why, we live in a very nostalgic culture right now. And it's one of the reasons why I think nostalgia is typically so unfulfilling, because, we're not actually nostalgic for this object or this item. What we're nostalgic for was a previous view that we had on this. And that previous view can never be reenacted because you're standing on a different rung now. And you can still look at the same artifact that you did when you're 7 years old, but the way you enact that artifact, your view of that artifact is going to be radically different. Right. And you're just left with a memory of a view rather than the ability to reproduce that view.
Right. And one of the things that can happen, and I think we'll talk about this when we talk about sort of the changes in generational views, is that particularly, and also keep in mind that we have upwards of perhaps a dozen multiple intelligences.
Right.
So we have cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, mathematical intelligence, musical intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, spiritual intelligence. And those can be at relatively different levels of development. So I always use Nazi doctors. They're very high cognitive, very low moral. But a lot of people are sort of high cognitive, high moral, and have no musical capacity anywhere in their body. I mean, so that can be almost zero.
Yep.
And some people that are really good at music claim that they have no mathematical capacity, and that, you know, they just don't get it. So that can be pretty low. But what can happen, particularly if you're looking at things like worldviews, and particularly given that, you know, these other lines can stay relatively developed, while in one line you can fairly completely regress. You really can sort of move down. And then what happens is, as you move down, for example, if you're at green rung and it's producing a pluralistic worldview, and you regress back to amber ethnocentric, then you can take all these other values and start to interpret them from an ethnocentric point of view.
Yep.
And that is one of the main problems that we're seeing with the culture wars.
Amen.
Because Graves' term for amber ethnocentric was absolutistic state.
Right.
And whenever you start to absolutize your ideas, that stage starts to feel better, feels more right, because that's where your absolutistic tendencies are. And you've got this view and you know it's right. And you can actually kind of start to regress to that. The problem is it's ethnocentric when you do that. So you've gone from world-centric to ethnocentric. You might even still be mouthing those values, but now you're doing it from a tribalized, polarized, absolutistic, ethnocentric stance. So you're absolutely sure that this is the one and only right way to view it, and everybody else is so wrong, you don't even have to listen to them. They don't even deserve to speak.
Yep.
That's our culture wars.
Yep.
And that, we'll come back to that, but that's really, really disastrous.
Fantastic.
And it happens because we do have these whole enfoldment principles of that one evolutionary thrust of the cosmos to continue, transcend and include, transcend and include, transcend and include. And so that actually creates rungs that we can't slide down to and not just go up. So that's kind of problematic. I think we covered non-exclusion. Let me just say a few brief things about those that we didn't touch on. The original point of calling it non-exclusion was that if you look at just the general Kuhnian notion that science doesn't just find data, that it has to engage in particular experiments, methods, tools to bring forth and disclose and enact data. And those paradigms or those exemplars are what's necessary in order to even be able to see that data, that experience. And by the way, experience and data mean essentially the same. William James pointed out that what we mean by data is a direct experience. And so that's why we sometimes call it data, experience, or illumination. They're all essentially similar. So you have a paradigm. And one of the most common things that will happen is that as you choose your particular methodology, your particular exemplar, it's often from one of the 8 zones, And then you'll generate a whole series of data, and that you'll know that that's what's important. That's right. So you keep working with your paradigm and you keep generating this kind of data. And then somebody comes along with a different set of conclusions. Mm-hmm. And what you'll tend to do is look at it because you know your methodology is working to produce real data. And then you see this other person with a set of data that disagrees with yours. And I mean, it could be something really, really sharply distinct. Like if you're studying cellular structure using a microscope, and so you start to think that cells are really sort of fundamental, you know, to all existence, and that kind of thing. And then you talk to somebody else who's a Zen Buddhist and claims that if your daddy is Satori, that you'll actually be able to experience the ground of all being. Then the first thing you're likely to do is say, that's garbage. There's no truth to that at all. But all you're doing, you haven't actually tried their paradigm. So you really don't know what their data is. You haven't seen it. You don't have any evidence to make that kind of judgment. You're allowed to make that judgment if you take up that paradigm. Take up that paradigm, generate that data, and then we'll listen to you. If you don't try the paradigm, you have no business saying it's not real.
Yep.
And that's the whole point about paradigms and data. You can't just shove data out of the way. You have to try the paradigm first. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, then you can make judgments. And within your own paradigm, you can make judgments. You can try an experiment, do it right. You can try an experiment, do it wrong. There are ways to make that within your paradigm. And anybody who tries that paradigm can repeat those results. Anybody who tries the paradigm of Zen, which is Zazen, or specific meditative perspectives and awareness, done for several years, that will tend to enact or bring forth an illumination known as Satori, and that will give you data about that dimension of reality. And so non-exclusion means you don't have a warrant to use your paradigm to deny somebody else's paradigm.
Yeah.
That's just, you don't have the evidence, you don't have the data, you don't have the facts. That's a judgment you are incapable of making. So please don't do it.
Right.
And what that means correlatively is that, okay, if I really want to see as much data as I can, I have to include as many paradigms as I can. And so you had to take it back a step to what you have to do in awareness in order to put yourself in the vicinity of the cosmic address of the phenomena you want to study. If you're not in the vicinity, you can't see it.
Right.
And you won't be in the vicinity if you don't use the right paradigm. So it shifted it all back to, okay, wait, how are you even looking at reality? Don't tell me you just stared out there and saw something, you think that's real, and you think everything else isn't real. That's useless. That's just wrong. So what we're really looking at when we talk about meta-theoretical integral is meta-paradigmatic or cross-paradigmatic. And that's one of the things that we do. And so even just in methodologies, although again it includes epistemologies in terms of levels of development, includes ontologies in terms of different phenomena that are enacted, but methodologies are do this type of exemplar, do this type of paradigm, do this type of practice, and it'll bring forth a set of data, a set of experiences, a set of illuminations. And that's where you got your data, was from this paradigm. And that's why all science is paradigm bound. So that's one of the things that we try to get across. And so when we talk about integral methodological pluralism, it means, okay, for starters, here's a major family of resemblances methodologies. And if you want to really understand that beginning, original, single happening, you can do at least these 8 different perspectives on it, and you'll see something real every time. And if you want anything resembling a comprehensive or a complete view, then that's what you do. And if you're not doing that, you're deliberately saying, no, I'm just going to toss out 3/4 of reality because I don't think I need it. And that's all it is.
Right.
Ridiculous.
Right.
So the only sort of strange thing about all of this is that it's not an approach that you often find recognized.
Right.
And one of the things that we're hoping as evolution continues its transcend and include, more and more people get into more integral stages of development, that the importance and necessity of these kinds of truly comprehensive approaches become more and more obvious.
Right.
And then hopefully the approaches to our problems will become more and more effective, because we're actually dealing with more and more of the factors that are actually causing the problems, instead of ignoring them as we tend to do now. So
yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ken, one of the reasons why I particularly love, talking about these 3 principles is I feel like they do a lot of things. They pull a lot of weight, because on the one hand, you can use them as, and you were sort of going in between. You can use them on this macro scale to help make sense of, 13 billion years of evolution. You can also use them to better understand and better discern the moment-to-moment unfolding right now, in the now moment, as we move forward. And that's, it's that sense of scale that I think is remarkable about, not just these 3 principles, but really your body of writing that we call Wilbur 5, altogether. Whereas I think Wilbur 4 was very much about, here's my model. I've done a lot of thought about this stuff. Here's my model, and there's quadrants and levels and lines and states and types, etc. With Wilbur 5, I feel like there was this, at least for me, my experience of your work is that you're actually leading people through the thought process itself. It is itself an expression of integral thinking, where it's almost to the point where it's like you're showing your math as you're giving us the equations here, and it's so fully plugged into the now moment that you can and also it's illuminating a territory that does become self-evident when you hit these altitudes.
Right.
And that's the power, I think, of these 3 principles. And for anyone who's listening, I highly if you've already read them, revisit them. Ken's got these I think there's 5 excerpts A, B, C, D, and G. No one knows what happened to E and F. We don't talk about E and F. But those excerpts are just absolutely amazing, and I think is some of your absolute finest work. So thank you for all of that. So the next question, which actually follows from our last episode together 2 months ago, where we were talking about what Doug Rushkoff has described as a generational shift away from the boomer, one blue marble vision of the television age to the millennial and Gen Z aversion to big pictures and grand narratives and all that in the internet age. So I thought we might have a little bit of fun, talking about generation theory, which I think is a very useful sort of cultural typology. And I think of it as a typology because we can see the very same values, amber values, orange values, green, teal, etc. They exist within all of these generations, but they're expressed somewhat differently from generation to generation. Right. Because, you've got different social pressures in the lower right and different cultural references in the lower left that each of these generations is inheriting. And those pressures are always evolving and shaping, sort of these generations differently. So one thing I'm noticing just in culture at large these days over the last several years is an apparent generational shift away from big macroscopic visions, things that we call like the view from 50,000 feet. And they're actually heading more towards a micro level application, which is, you know, in the lower right quadrant, we see this as like microtransactions in video games. Or in the lower left, it's microaggressions. You know, it's everything is being geared towards this very, very, you know, sort of the minutia. Again, getting down to it's almost like, how is this unfolding right now in the now moment? Don't give me your big, you know, sort of overarching frameworks. I want to know how this is kind of landing right now. It's almost like, you know, as technology continues to advance, our total informational resolution continues to increase, but the higher the resolution, the easier it is to get lost in the details. Never, you know, you stop noticing that big picture view. You only see trees, you never see forest. Part of this, you know, I'm sure we will attribute to, you know, the well-known postmodern resistance to these kinds of grand narratives, particularly now that postmodernism has so saturated our culture. But at the same time, you guys, you know, the boomers, you guys are the ones who made postmodernism mainstream in the first place, and you guys sure loved your big picture views, whether it's the integral view from 50,000, I'm not calling that postmodern, don't get me wrong, but in terms of what your generation is attracted to, you know, ecological views and environmentalism, all the way to like new age ideas like the age of Aquarius. All of these are just great big overarching frameworks, and usually the postmodernists will tell you, well, don't call it a framework and we'll let you get away with it. So I'm curious what, you know, looking at all this, I'm curious what the possible implications might be here for us, for our continued mission to spread the integral message and get these ideas out there and communicate it in a skillful way that people can really resonate with. So I'm wondering whether this shift, sort of this macro to micro shift that we're seeing, you know, again, generationally, I wonder if there's an opportunity there. I wonder if it's actually placing a healthy pressure upon the Integral project at large to begin turning our attention to exactly that, these sort of micro level solutions and applications, which is one of the reasons I wanted to preempt this conversation with the one about the three principles, because I think they scale, you know, beautifully. In other words, it seems to me that the boomers and older Xers will continue to be attracted to these macro visions, while younger generations might get turned on purely by the micro level solutions that can fix a, you know, a specific problem in a specific quadrant in a specific way. Fortunately, again, I think the integral model really does have this all covered. All of this is baked in, precisely because it's, you know, we might call it so holographic. It generates a tremendous amount of value at whatever scale it's being enacted. So I think that's encouraging, but I'm wondering again if there's a muscle that's waiting to be developed here. So it might be a nice invitation to think of some novel ways to explore the integral approach and integral communication that'll be more naturally appealing to some of these younger generations.
Yeah, it's if you look at this increasing switch to micro approaches, I think there are a couple of contributing factors to that, and one of them, as you pointed out, I think is technology. And as it's gotten more and more sophisticated, more and more complicated and complex, it can go into such a high degree of resolution, and there's such a staggering amount of information, all of it going in so many different ways, that it's very hard to, you know, even think of big pictures that can sort of encompass all of that. Now, it's not impossible, and we think, you know, various integral models can give a pretty good embrace of that, but it is harder to do. And if you don't already have some sort of integral meta theory at your disposal, then you're just kind of overwhelmed by all this stuff. And then that, of course, is greatly complicated by the fact that green really has kind of settled in as the main value structure of the leading edge.
Mm-hmm.
And so as new generations come in and they have any sort of progressive tendencies in them at all, then they tend to look to the leading edge, and that's what they see.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the leading edge of green is an extreme green. It's sort of become broken in some ways. It's become absolutized. And this is really disastrous, given the fact that green is the major leading edge of cultural evolution right now. And the sort of leading edge is integral, but we only have about 4 or 5% of the population there, whereas green, 25% or so. And so it really is kind of the leading edge there. And part of the problem that we have is, well, again, first of all, is the fact that these, in the culture wars, these, and the culture wars are, by the way, the battle between the three most recent major stages of development, mm-hmm. Amber, orange, and green, and their respective value systems, which is traditional amber, modern orange, and postmodern multicultural green. Mm-hmm. And those three values are at each other's throats, and they're becoming more so the more absolutized they become. Because the more absolutized they become, the more they tend to move back down to that absolutistic stage, mm-hmm. which is where absolutism feels best. And by the way, you can be an absolutistic Marxist, an absolutistic scientist, they're called scienticians. You can be an absolutistic feminist, absolutistic white supremacist. I mean, any higher level can start to get absolutized and find itself very much at home in that absolutistic stage. And the only problem is that the absolutistic stage is ethnocentric.
Right.
And that means inherently tribalized. And in that case, it means only talking about how your tribe is different from all the others. You never talk about what your tribe has in common with all the others. That doesn't even make sense to somebody who's, a feminist or Black Lives Matter or white supremacist, or, choose your bad guy. Whenever it becomes tribalized, then that is a disaster for the culture it's in, because you just have diversity, not unity in diversity.
Right.
And again, that unity and diversity is what evolution fought 300,000 years for.
Right.
It was the only time that we started to value world-centric morality, where all people are treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, creed, gender, ethnicity. Instead, it's just, oh, I'm just female, or oh, I'm just gay, or I'm just black, or and I'm different from all the others. Mm-hmm. And that is disastrous.
Yeah, it's like non-exclusion without the enfoldment.
Well, that's exactly right. And so, and it dies hard because everybody's born at square one. So it doesn't matter that we have constitutional principles stemming from world-centric stages, because everybody's still born at square one and has to grow through all those things. And that goes for countries around the world. Slavery was still legal in Peru up until 1968.
Right.
It was legal in India until 1976. So it's a battle that has to be fought with every newborn human being. And the moment we stop doing that, it all collapses. we go back to the ethnocentric stances that humanity had for most of its history, which is why most of its history has been driven by warfare, hatred, torture, murder, disaster after disaster, one tribe always enslaving other tribes and dominating them. I mean, it's just a horror show.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we fought to overcome, because the angels of our better nature are better than that. And so part of the problem is that as we moved out of these ethnocentric stages and started to move into world-centric, then the first world-centric stage was orange. And that is where we got the Western Enlightenment. That is where we got the Universal Bill of Rights, where all people are treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. That's where, again, in that 100-year period, those orange principles of universal freedom and equality were applied to more and more and more tribes. So there was abolition of slavery. There was the suffragettes and giving women the rights. There was gay marriage and giving gays equal rights, and just more and more and more tribes, and down to even finer and finer proportions. And we start working for women's rights. Women are like 51% of the population. And then we just keep going. We get down to gay rights. That's about 7% of the population. Then we keep going down to transgender rights. That's about 1/10 of 1/10 of 1% of the population. But we're still applying those principles.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom and equality for all people. Christ. Going backwards into that ethnocentric tribal is everything we fought to overcome. It's everything we fought to overcome. And identity politics, if it's not done extremely carefully, and it never is tribal politics. And that's what's so disastrous about it. And yet that is the dominant belief system in our educational system today. Kids in college are not getting education, they're getting an indoctrination into tribalism. And that's just sad. It's just sad. And one of the places you see the friction the greatest is both orange and green want equality. And they both say that, and they both mean it. But they're two very different types of equality. And they're actually contradictory. And this is part of the difficulty with the culture wars, and part of the difficulty in the social strife we're seeing right now. Orange, which was the original liberal orientation, the liberal political party was invented in the Western Enlightenment by orange. And whereas the previous political orientation supported the culture as it was, so it supported the king or queen, it supported the dominant church, that was all good. It supported all its traditional values. It wanted to conserve those, so those were the conservatives. Mm-hmm. Then there's this newfangled stage of development called orange that was starting things like modern sciences and started to believe in things like evolution. So it was called progressive because that's what it believed in. Not conservative, but progressive. And okay, one of them sat on the left side of the French Assembly, one of them sat on the right side, so they called the left and the right. And what orange, which became known as liberal, because it was more open than the conservative traditional values, mm-hmm. It wanted equal opportunity. That was the type of equality it wanted. And so, again, because these principles were of necessity applied to the dominant tribe of the time, the tribe that ran a particular culture, then originally it was applied to white, able-bodied, cisgendered males. But they kept, because the principles said all humans, they kept applying them to more and more and more tribes. So they applied those principles to blacks, freed the blacks. They applied it to women, gays, transgender, etc. And the whole point about that kind of equality, which was often called freedom, because it meant freedom to have equal access to what society offered. So freedom for a liberal, an orange liberal, for women, meant that women had equal opportunity in education, for example, equal opportunity to get into college. Mm-hmm. And that was what they wanted. So in the 1970s, when these values sort of really kicked in and started applying to other tribes, the percentage of women graduating from college was 39%. 61% of college graduates were men. Mm-hmm. That wasn't freedom, according to the orange liberal stance, which was still very strong at that time. Mm-hmm. And so measures were taken to try and reverse that. They were wildly successful, so much so that as of last year, the percentage of college degrees going to women is now 61%.
Wow.
And the percent going to men is only 39%. Some say we've gone a little bit too far, but that's okay. But the point was equal opportunity. And so what that means, you have an Olympic race, then you make sure that everybody who's qualified and deserves to run in that race gets to run in that race. Then you line them up. First person across the finish line gets a gold medal. Second person gets a silver medal. Third person gets a bronze. Okay. As we move into green and we move into relativistic perspectives, then all of a sudden it's becoming harder and harder for green to assign any priorities to any sort of groups, except it wants everybody to have equality. But now equality doesn't mean equal opportunity. It wants equal outcome. And that's very, very different. Mm-hmm. So equal outcome means not just the people start the race at the same time, but they all finish the race at the same time. And if that doesn't happen, then there's not equality. Something is wrong. And so what green would do is look at that whether there's equal outcome between men and women when it comes to STEM professions. Mm-hmm. And they find, no, there's a lot more men in the STEM professions than there are women. So they don't have equal outcome. They're not all finishing the race at the same time. Men are finishing it ahead. That's not fair. So they aren't bothered by the fact that there are more women in every other profession, 61% to 39%, and the only professions that men still occupy more of are just the STEM professions. Mm-hmm. So they don't like that, and they won't be happy until it's 50-50. And that's where we start to run into problems, because it doesn't allow that there might be some sort of different interests that, on average, men and women might have. So, for example, why is it, of all the professions that women now dominate, that men used to dominate? I mean, there are now more women physicians, lawyers, biologists, psychologists, therapists, sociologists, humanities. Mm-hmm. And yet men still hold out in the STEM profession. So why is that? We can see a similar situation if we look at what are generally agreed to be the least sexist, most gender neutral cultures in the world, the Scandinavian countries. Mm. If we look at those, they have done more than any other cultures anywhere on the planet to rid themselves of sexism. So if you find some sort of professions that are massively dominated by one sex or the other, it's probably not just oppression that's doing that. It's probably something else that's doing that. Well, if we look at a helping profession like nursing, the ratio of women to men is 20 to 1. Mm-hmm. It's staggering. If we look at engineering, STEM, it's also staggeringly huge in just the opposite direction. It's 20 to 1 men. Okay, so why? If it's not oppression, why are those happening? There have been a lot of various types of research that claim to show differences between, on average, men and women. There have been studies trying to show that there's difference in preferred sexual behavior patterns, with men being more promiscuous. There have been studies attempting to show that when it comes to math and verbal abilities, men do a bit better in math, women a bit better in verbal, those kinds of things. The one difference that is the largest, that has been replicated in more cultures than any other, that lasts throughout the entire lifetimes of men and women, and it literally shows up on the first day of birth. And that difference is baby girls are more interested in people and baby boys are more interested in things. Mm. So things mean dead, inanimate, non-living things like engineering, mathematics, technology. And women, anything living, anything people. And that's why they're psychology, sociology, doctors, nurses, lawyers. And that's at least one factor that a comprehensive examination of these things would want to look at. Mm-hmm. So if there really are 20 to 1 women to men in nursing, do we want to say that's unfair and start trying to reduce women and increase men because the equal outcome is so different? Well, this is where orange and green radically disagree.
Right.
And the problem is, since equal opportunity, as I said, is often called freedom, and equal outcome is often called equality. I think it was Alex de Tocqueville that first pointed out that, this is sort of a paraphrase quote, since human beings are born with different capacities, you can have either freedom or equality, but you can't have both. And that's right, you can't.
It's a polarity.
Exactly. So we have these contradictory battles. And of course, just the reflex integral response is somehow we have to include both and balance both. We don't want to just focus on one or just focus on the other. And so there are people that focus on just freedom. So if we say, okay, as long as there's nothing stopping equal opportunity for some minority, then that's all we need. That's freedom. That's all the equality that we can't get. That's all we need. So they just focus on that, even though there might be certain groups, certain ethnicities, certain races, certain sexes that always finish, 20 yards behind everybody else. You have to look at that equal outcome and go, okay, what's going on there? Mm-hmm. Now, it might be there are differences in interests. It might be that there are differences in athletic capability. I mean, 70% of the NBA are blacks. Less than 1% are Jews. We don't really get that upset and say, Jews are being oppressed from basketball. But we want to look at all of those factors and take them into account. And also balancing freedom and equality means balancing orange and green. Yep. And so one of the things we're seeing in the shift from boomers and Xers to millennials and Z Gen is that shift from freedom to equality. So over 40% of millennials say they favor socialism, which is an equal outcome system. Free market capitalism is an equal opportunity system. Green is willing to suspend free speech if it seems to impact equality. Even if there's speech that seems to hurt the feelings of a minority, then we interrupt that free speech. And again, over 40% of millennials say they're in favor of the government suppressing free speech if it's going to hurt anybody's feelings. Canada's C-16 bill has compelled language that forces people to speak in terms of transgendered pronouns. So everybody has equal outcome there. There's no more equal opportunity at all. So this is one of the biggest battles we see. And one of the reasons it's a problem is people don't realize that these are two entirely different types of equality. One freedom, one more literal equality. And those two you have to balance them. You're never going to get it right, but you can't do just one or just the other. That's the disaster.
Right.
But that's what the culture wars want. And so that's one of the problems we're having with these younger generations. And so the boomers would tend to kind of go for a bit more big pictures, and they would have freedom of opportunity and free speech at Berkeley in 1967 meant freedom to say anything you wanted.
Yep.
Free speech in Berkeley today means how we can curtail your free speech to stop you from engaging in hate speech. So again, there's some truth to both of those, but we have to balance them. Right now, all they're doing is trying to kill each other, and that's a disaster. And it's really a disaster because both of them can talk equality, even though they're very, very contradictory versions of equality. And so people don't get that. So one of the things that we have to do is start taking that into account. And then the final thing I would say, just sort of in general about some of that, is because these culture wars are a battle between amber, orange, and green, often in their absolutized extreme forms. But whether they were healthy or not healthy, the only way they're really going to be integrated is with the shift to second tier. And we need some sort of leading edge in the culture to start coming from teal. And it looks like that a leading edge can start to come into play when about 10% of the population reaches that level. So we have about 5% now. The sooner we can get to about 10%, and people will start looking at equality in terms of all the factors that actually go into it, instead of, oh, just equal outcome, or, oh, just equal opportunity. What you find, for example, is that social justice advocates, the ones that will stand up at conferences and universities and scream people down and just yell and, do anything they can to disrupt somebody who's saying something that disagrees with them. And then so their stance is they'll look at like 100 people and they'll say, we include everybody. We love everybody. We want all this diversity to be included. All of these people get included. And that's fine, but that's just looking at it from an exterior stance. Because if you look at, for example, Keegan's research, he finds that in America, 3 out of 5 people don't make it to the orange modern stage. So that means you're sitting here saying, oh, I want to include all 100 of these people. Well, 60 of those 100 people don't agree with you.
Right.
They don't share those values. They don't want that. Yell at them all you want. They don't give a shit. And all you're going to do is antagonize them, make it worse, make the polarization greater, and therefore increase bigotry and prejudice in this country. And that's exactly what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
There are no good guys in this thing. It's one tribe against another tribe against another tribe. And all they're doing is emphasizing how they're different from everybody. And that polarizes them, drives them all back to ethnocentric, amber orientations. And there's no easy way out of that. So what we want to see is some sort of center of gravity start to shift into second tier.
Yep.
And one of the things that would help with that is having people at green, particular ones who are exit green, start to adopt a little bit more healthy green values.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, they're just too extreme. They're polarized, they're absolutized, and they're tending to be not world-centric, but ethnocentric with their identity politics. And so you can go into any situation where they're working on a problem, like, oh, we've got these 100 people and only 60 of them don't agree with us, and only 40 of them seem to agree with us. So what are we going to do about that? And you can say, okay, well, just notice that your values, you weren't born with those. And that as you grew and developed, and we have some evidence for this, your values got more inclusive, and now you've come to a position where you can do that because you've actually developed that as a mental capacity. You
Mm-hmm.
couldn't do that when you were 5 years old. You couldn't do that when you were 10 years old. You can do it now because you've grown and developed to these even higher, broader ways. And so you just introduce small little bits of integral into micro problems they're actually dealing with, and help show them that that can help with your little micro problem. You don't have to give them the whole meta theory.
Right.
It's just little parts that address each of these micro issues that they're working on. And that at least can sort of help move things forward. And that's sort of one way to think about these issues. It's really getting crucial. It's really ugly.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you for that, Ken. And, one of the things that I notice is that, it seems like every generation comes of age in often a radically different cultural backdrop. And that cultural backdrop often includes, particularly in the 20th and 21st centuries, some very, very different and very, very powerful sort of inherited cultural archetypes, like you guys grew up in the shadow of one of the most powerful visual archetypes we've ever had, the mushroom cloud.
Right.
And then 20 years later, spit out the other side with, it's interesting how these archetypes sort of unfold because they often contradict each other. So you had the mushroom cloud in the 40s. Then in the 60s, we get the very first image of the Earth from space.
Right.
The very first image, which just synced up so naturally with all the postmodern values and views that were beginning to emerge at that time. It all happened sort of within this, those two archetypes, the mushroom cloud and the Earth from space. These are mutually exclusive, guys.
Right.
We've got a choice to make, and it's either one or the other. And that itself, I think, largely unconsciously informed the work that you guys did, how you interpreted reality. I mean, any number of things. Now, for millennials growing up are sort of suspended in between two different kinds of archetypes, which you could say would be, the blue marble versus, I don't know, the World Trade Center collapsing in 2001. That was the main visual archetype that itself impacts and affects how they interpret reality, how they interpret, even a single word like socialism, as you mentioned. Well, you guys were very, obviously very resistant to ideas of socialism because you were dealing with the Cold War and the hangover that happened after the Cold War. While the millennials, that's not their experience. So they actually enact these words in a very different way.
Yeah.
I often joke that my generation, I'm a Gen Xer, but I'm a young Gen Xer. They call me the Zennials.
Yeah.
So we're right between millennials and Xers. I call us the video game generation. But one of the things that I notice is that my generation relates to something like sex very differently than the generation before us and the generation after us. And the big major reason for that is, the boomers, you guys had, free love and all that stuff, and, sexual self-determinism and all of that. The millennials got, internet pornography. That's what they're raised with. What did the Xers get? We got AIDS, right? That was our lesson, our coming of age lesson as it revolved around sexuality, and all sorts of garbage followed that as a result. All sorts of pathologies and neuroses and anxieties and all that my generation in particular is deeply afflicted with, because some of our first early education about sex was, if you put it in there, you might die. Holy shit, that's good.
Yeah.
So when I extrapolate that even to the level of like enacting Integral and enacting your work, it's not difficult for me to step into some very, very different perspectives at very, very, different age groups that are going to have a different relationship with some of these terms than they will with others.
Right.
So younger generations are going to be much more open to, because of the successes of feminism and the successes of, the post-Cold War world and all that, they're going to be much more open to more communal sorts of more collectivist kind of language. Whereas, again, you guys really weren't, which made sense because you were resisting, Stalin. So it's a really interesting conversation, because it does seem like these things color our interpretation and even our very enactment of these terms and our understanding of these kinds of models.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lands differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just kind of that's going to happen indefinitely.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
One of the whole points about the integral model, at least as I've developed it, is that whenever I would come on a new area that seemed to be really important, but also wasn't getting, very much attention,
Mm-hmm.
then the idea was, how do I want to present that? And to what degree of detail do I want to present that?
Mm-hmm.
And often what I would do is really go through a new area. It might be like deconstruction theory.
Mm-hmm.
I would go through just literally hundreds of books and have an enormous amount of information on it and data. And I would have all these sort of conclusions about all these kinds of detailed things. And then I would always just back up and take just the most prominent broad areas that needed to be included.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would include those and say, okay, whatever else you do, these are important areas that these new paradigms have disclosed. And so however you fill these in with whatever details you want, just make sure you're covering these broad areas. And then other than that, that's fine. And then often I would in, heavy sort of footnotes, I would give a lot of details that I felt about it, but I also, make sure that people understood that they could accept that or not. But it was just the broad overview stuff that really had to be included. And so that's what you tend to see with generations. I mean, each of them are filling in details in completely different ways often. But you can still spot the broad currents that are similar.
Right.
So even if one generation is focusing largely on a different level or different line or different state, they're still focusing on level. There's still levels and there's still lines and there's still
Exactly.
state, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And so tracking those, because they show up differently all the time. And that's a whole discipline in itself. saying, okay, here's what this is, here's what that is. And that's sort of what we've been talking about a fair amount today, is how different generations have been impacted by these elements in different ways.
Yep.
And that'll always happen. That'll
Yep.
sort of keep occurring.
It's true, particularly as technology continues to accelerate, the gaps between these generations are just going to increase. I mean, 200 years ago, it didn't make sense to talk about generations because you lived the same lifestyle your dad and your grandpa did. Now everything moves so fast. Well, Ken, this has been absolutely fantastic, and I love the point you made at the end, which is I think this conversation itself is an opportunity for a lot of the people listening to expand their tool set when it comes to skillful communication. So next time you're talking to someone and you want to, introduce Integral to them for the first time, maybe your first move isn't to whop them over the head with a, 300-pound Ken Wilber book, but maybe it's to start with a conversation about integral thinking and about even integral practice, because these are the things that really meet people on a very personal and a very micro level.
Right.
And it's a great way to sort of meet people where they are and begin a breadcrumb trail that will hopefully take them on a whole new life's journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Ken, thank you so much for your time. 2.5-hour call. This has been epic.
Wonderful, buddy.
Yeah. And we will talk to you again next month.
You got it.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you soon. Take care.